Right, let's get on with it. So welcome to the I've got the wrong title here, so I do apologize. It is for
Day
Marketing
three of,
Cloud Developer.
yes, day three.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll correct it when we share the deck. But assume that this states it is Marketing Cloud Developer Day 3, and we're trying to get through that. The focus for today is going to be on APIs, but before we get with the start, just want to thank people for taking time, A, joining today, and B, I feel very passionate about developers in Marketing Cloud in the sense that numerous conversations when people talk about developer in marketing is not a true developer and the architect is not a true architect, which I don't agree with that personally. And therefore, for everyone who is putting their effort to learn and get better at doing certain things within the platform, I'm really supportive and really excited about that. So thank you for your investment and your interest to learn. The plan for me today is just kind of give you an overview of Marketing Cloud APIs, and I'm going to take it with a point of view where I'm not going to make any assumptions. So if you're more or less experienced, or if you're just a bit experienced, I'm not going to sort of target it. I'm going to look into the prism of we kind of introducing you to the world of Marketing Cloud APIs, give you some tips and pointers on where you can continue your learning and how do you actually practically start exploring the platform to prepare for the exam, obviously. And the whole talk is like, I would assume that you don't have a background with APIs because in my experience, I found that a lot of consultants, when they get into more development sort of tasks, they tend to focus in certain areas of the application. So I found like a good portion of people would be very skilled with writing M script and running up some SQL maybe, but not necessarily ever touched API itself, or the other way around. So if you have a good background with Marketing Cloud APIs, it might be a bit boring for you, but nonetheless, at least one of the things to be mindful of is just what are the areas that you need to focus on when you're preparing for the exam. And that's the aim. And then from the platform perspective, the demo I want to do is just show again with the concept of people who are new to that, how do you start your practical journey if you do want to go into some of the practical hands-on and effectively do some exercises. So what do you need to do on the platform in order to get enabled and start exploring? And without any further delays, I'm going to kick in. So in terms of API, the exam sort of focuses about 20% of the exam is structured around Marketing Cloud APIs. And there are a number of things that you need to be familiar with when it comes down to the exam. I begin usually with describing different packages that we have for Marketing Cloud. When you start configuring the platform integration within the setup section of the platform, you will be asked to look into what are the different options that you need to configure the packages and the selections that you can choose. You can see there is API, there's Marketing Cloud apps, there are extensions for Journey and Contact Builder and so forth. The focus that we really need to be going through is API. And there are different types of integration when it comes down to that, because integration could be done in different ways. You've got like a web application that consume platform resources or integrate and talk to that. There's different layer of security, how you configure and how you consume the API, how do you connect to the Marketing Cloud platform. There are public apps which are even less secure potentially than mobile apps. So again, there's a different constraint, and you usually fall down to using what we call an authorization code, which sort of executes on behalf of the user. So the user needs to be actively involved into authorizing or approving or allowing the application or the web pages to interact with the platform on their behalf. And quite often, if you see that it's something like if you compare the experience with social signups when you use, for example, I know very common today, Google identity. And if you sign up to a particular service and you say, well, I want to use my, Google ID or Google credentials for authorization, then it's kind of like a similar experience. The platform will navigate you to the Google authorization service and ask you, are you happy for an application or a web page to consume some of your details, and we'll show you what particular information you're going to be consuming. So these are the web apps and public applications that are sort of done in that way. And then on the right hand side is the server to server, which is credential-based connectivity. This is the most common in the sense where, at least it was most common. I think maybe these days we sort of slightly changing and seeing more extensions of the platform, but practically the server-to-server is the one that we look into when two platforms need to talk to each other. So in the case of taking maybe Marketing Cloud and commerce products, when you need to integrate two together, like initiate communications from the commerce experience based on customer behaviors, that's essentially where the server would come in. It is important to know that when you do configuration, and that's something that I will demonstrate to you today towards the end of the session, is the configuration. What are the items that you need to use in order to get the credentials, and what do these credentials consist of? So that's something kind of to be familiar with for sure from the exam standpoint of view. So the client ID and client secret, its authentication flow, and the way the platform integrate is, it's kind of like server to server. So you don't need a user intervention into establishing the credentials and authentication. Effectively, platforms just talk to each other in the traditional sort of sense. Now, within the Marketing Cloud platform, we do recognize two API types these days: the REST API, which is more modern, and I'll start with that. Kind of go through different use cases. It is, as you can see, started, we call it more modern, but it's been, what, 12 years now, 10 years that we've introduced it in 2012. It's like we started with Marketing Cloud, based sort of core marketing and journeys that we might refer to, but this is not quite that. The REST API is actually targeting some of more add-on products to the old ExecTarget email platform. So once we start looking into the mobile studio, once we start looking into introduction of the contact builder, contact model, journey builder, all of these new products were built up with REST API in mind. We didn't want to expand and extend the SOAP API because it's considered to be less modern, and most of the modern development traditionally seems to be focused around REST. It's easy to consume, it's lighter payloads, it's more common approach and standard, and therefore even from developer readiness, we see that a lot more people can actually understand how to work with that. It's not as complete. So one interesting thing that we sort of faced with introduction of the REST API, it's extending the platform capabilities, but it's not covering or not providing full parity with what you used to do with SOAP. And therefore, even today, the reason why we still have both is because one part of the platform capability is covered through SOAP, and the other part of the capabilities is covered through REST. So these two APIs coexist, and depending on their use cases, while we do have some overlap today, you still end up, for most common scenarios, using a mixture of both to certain degrees. Interesting that when we introduced REST API, there was a bit of a challenge with credentials, and we sort of needed to ensure that we're providing scalability and ability to work at the enterprise business unit structure. So respecting the hierarchy, respecting that a particular user can be part of one or more business units, therefore restrain their access or expand their access and so forth. But when you do work with the API, what you need to know is it is still tied up to a business unit level. So when you execute any sort of REST calls, you need to identify yourself what is the context or what is the business unit effectively that you're working in. And any calls that need to go across multiple business units, you actually need to run them multiple times with resetting credentials and so forth. So that's something to be aware of, that it is tied to a business unit, but you've got an ability as well to configure separate credentials and set up different permissions or scope of the API when it comes down to getting the tokens and effectively executing that. Keep in mind that REST has been continuously evolved and developed, and it's something that we sort of see still as a future for our platform, at least with the plans as we see today. Now, from the exam perspective and from the practical use case, it is important to know what are the products that we support within the Marketing Cloud product suite when it comes down to the use of this particular API. So if you need to think about, integrating with journey, integrating with contact model, doing mobile activities, all of these, and actually content as well, which was another fantastic addition to the layer, because it provides quite a flexible framework for integrating Marketing Cloud with any other CMS if we need to, because the API is really full and rich, and it's very flexible in how it supports it. So knowing the use cases for your exam is important to think from the perspective of if a customer needs to integrate, let's say, an external CMS platform with Marketing Cloud, what API method you would use, then you kind of need to think, number one, it's a REST API, and number two, what particular method within the REST APIs you need to be identifying or using for that particular integration. So that's how to think about the APIs. The overview of the REST itself is an API. You've got an endpoint, which is important to know. And from an exam perspective, what we tell all the developers that sort of step into that space, you have to be familiar with most commonly used endpoints. And for the exam, there is a set of specific sort of API endpoints that we want you to be familiar with. But I mean, practically, if you're a developer, it's worthwhile going through and understanding. You don't have to go through every single method potentially, but you need to know the endpoint. So you need to understand the differences between the journey, between the contact model, between the content itself. Like these are the different endpoints you will see, and then the path itself for using that. It's equally important to remember that going forward, and that's something that we wanted to include in the exam, is using the tenant endpoints for interacting with API. We don't want to go into generic API endpoint. We actually have a tenant-specific endpoints, and if you following Marketing Cloud, which I'm sure that all of you are, we are sort of moving towards the concept that generic API should cease to exist at some point in time. So with the move into public cloud, with the move in introduction of the Hyperforce, where everything is hosted in the different places, we certainly want to ensure that every tenant, which represents the customer, have their own entry point into the API. So A, there is a performance benefit, B, there is security benefit, and C, it kind of helps to ensure that when you're interacting, you know that you're interacting with your own account. Method-wise, this is normal REST API. So if you don't have any familiarity with how REST APIs work, think of them as you've got like normal web pages, right? You interact with the pages, you go through from page to page to page. There's a different type of request that we send with every interaction. So the platform could be sending up and asking for a web service to say the GET request. So give me information, retrieve the information. And usually these are the HTTP GET methods. Now, if you're submitting the details to the web service, then usually you use the POST method. And an example in traditional normal HTML, you see that when you're submitting the form on the web page, that is effectively using HTTP POST method. So we're posting the information, we're sending it out. Put and delete are traditionally add-ons. Put could be a mixed use case, but in essence, from our use cases, you think of them as just we extending or updating the records that we might have in the platform already. So if you need to add additional attributes, if you need to send additional payload, if you need to push the file, and then delete the reverse, right? We're doing the deletion of the records in the platform. So if you think of them, get, post, put, and delete, they are effectively CRUD, or create, read, update, and delete in the traditional sort of data operations. Headers within the REST API calls are significant as well. That's where we provide, include the payload to identify a customer or identify the sending platform. So that's where authentication gets added in and so forth. And then within the actual payload, the body of the request, depending on the type and the method, you may or may not have an information. So if you're doing the GET, which is usually done like through URL, so you've got these question mark and ampersand signs that kind of show you like, I need to retrieve certain details. Versus if you have a POST method, you would normally have some sort of field. So you've got like the key value. So this is my field name, this is the value that I present, and these are the details that then being transformed into payload and then passed into the platform. The important routes, like as I said, we've got a number of key ones that we want you to be familiar with and flexible in a way that not just knowing that, yes, there is a journey builder path or transactional messaging path. We want you to know these quite well. So for developer exam, if you want to feel comfortable that you're ready and be able to have that confidence to pass the exam from API standpoint of view, you'd be surprised. We do drill you, I wouldn't hesitate to use that word, on knowing a bit lower level of details. It is significant, it's important, because we wanted to maintain the exam in more a practical space rather than conceptual space. Therefore, if you have never really run at least one API call, I feel like you'll struggle with the API section and portion of the exam. So it's super important that you know these, but more kind of going back to the point, where do you focus your studies? Because I mean, the REST API is quite significant. There's quite a lot of different options. You need to know the most common ones across these routes. So you need to understand how to interact with the content assets, how to reach out and talk to the platform notification services for the cases when, and what is supported from these API methods, how to get the journey triggered. And then when it comes down to the messaging, the transactional email is quite an important concept for us. Therefore, we want you to be familiar with that. In terms of structure, when you think about the REST routes, right, we utilize a JSON payload, and therefore, when we push the information to the platform or send the information to the platform and receive the responses back, the payloads are in JSON format, which is giving you that sort of notion of how do you need to prepare your data or parse the result set. And significance of that particular notion is to understand within the use cases, if you need to think about working with the data that comes up in the API payload, if it's a JSON format, you would straight away understand implications within the platform. If you want to use the JSON payload in SQL, that's a very heavy exercise. If you want to use the JSON payload in the response in the landing pages, you need to sort of think through accurately what is the right language to use, like the Marketing Cloud scripting language, to use to parse that and present the results back to the user. So if someone is working with the landing page and maybe looking into, let's say previously, like the orders that a person have been sort of sending through, or some of the products in the cart, or some of the offers that we might want to present to the customer, then if they're coming up as a JSON payload, there's at least two good ways to work with it. You've got server-side JavaScript, and you've got guide template language that provides you flexibility and ease of working with the JSON payload, as opposite to going into mscript, where you might have to struggle a bit to easily transform and perform the rendering of that payload. When it comes down to the calls, the concept of synchronous versus asynchronous is, again, significantly valuable. You need to know that when we do REST API, most of the calls are in synchronous mode, meaning that when we send the request from the endpoint, so let's say you have a commerce platform that sends a notification to Marketing Cloud for, let's say, a data payload, the customer purchases with what is in the cart or something like that, then until the Marketing Cloud provides the response back, the system will be sort of in the pending waiting state. So normally it's referred to as being in the lock mode, and it doesn't move on. So the longer the API interaction takes time, as a user who is currently interacting with the platform in the commerce side of things, you would start seeing that the page load time, right? So you see that the page is sort of doing something, but it's not loading, it's not continuing the experience for me. So that's where that synchronous is important, because it does impact directly on the performance on the other side outside of Marketing Cloud. But we do support a number of operations in the asynchronous mode, and knowing which are these is good, because it does sort of help you with specifically like message sending, with the data payload sending. And the difference of these would be, in the synchronous, the platform triggers the message, provides the payload, and then waits for Marketing Cloud to accept, process, and then respond back to say, yes, that's cool, I received your call, I pushed it into the platform, we've done respective processing, everything is great, and provides you the status code. If there was an error within the platform, it tells you immediately. If it's successful, again, you know immediately what is the outcome. With a synchronous approach, it's different, because we letting platform to do the call, the external platform Marketing Cloud accepts the call and immediately provides receipt back to say, thank you, I accepted the payload, but there is no guarantee that it's going to be processed in the next minute, 30 seconds to hours, like it just literally goes into the platform queue. And then what is the result? So you kind of need to think of the integration pattern, synchronous versus asynchronous, is With synchronous, you do one call, you get the response back and you handle it. With asynchronous, you need to do one call, handle the acceptance or acknowledgement receipt, and then you need to do a second call to follow up. What is the status of that payload? So it's a very different integration pattern. And it does make a difference when you think about that architecturally or from the implementation standpoint of view, because you kind of need to think about the different ways of handling that. Knowing the timeout. So, I mean, like any other exam, when you look into some of the key learnings, if you see numbers, figures that talk about some significant points, they are important. So if you're talking here, it's timeout for operations is important because it tells you if we're going to send the synchronous call and the platform doesn't respond back within, say, 60 seconds or 120 seconds, then you get back the response that it timed out. And this is kind of goes back to, okay, so what do I do next? It's really a question around there might be an error and I need to handle that. And it tells you similar idea from the design standpoint of view, from the implementation standpoint of view, different approach for different use cases to handle. And knowing the maximum payload, again, there is a limit of how much information you can push. So quite often when it comes down to why it is important to know the payload size is at the time of design. When you think about integration and you're talking about, so I've got a payload of, let's say, half of the gigabyte of transactional data from the last week, that's not the API, right, approach. This is not going to work because you kind of need to slice it into so many API calls. It's inefficient to do that. And that's where, as a developer or as an architect, you need to draw the balance between what is the right use case for an API integration versus doing the file-based integration, as an example. So that's why it is important to know what are the sizes of payload, because you can quickly assess if this use case implies a large volume of data in transaction and transitioning between the platforms, then you already should start questioning if the API is the right way to even handle that. Okay, so that's something to kind of bear in mind from the perspective of exam 2. Transactional API, transactional messaging, as I said, this is really something that we're excited about, and a lot more sort of tend to happen within this specific space. We've seen quite a great adoption of this API across the platform over the course of last maybe 2 years. I wouldn't hesitate to say whatever the period is, but at least over the course of last year, we've seen more and more customers using that, adopting that. And the way we're trying to think through is a single sort of entry point for messaging. So we've got a specific use cases. It talks about transactional message. So it's not about marketing promotions. It's not about thinking that you want to send an offer and so forth. Absolutely not. These are the use cases where you need to respond to customer, faster. So you've kind of have like an SLA embedded into that. You need to provide almost real-time response as close as possible. Think about resetting your password, purchase order confirmation, notification about shipment, and so forth. So anything that is not commercial in nature, where we're not advertising to the customers, but rather informing them about the key milestone of the life cycles and their interactions with the brand. So we're responding back to their points or notifying them about the events that are happening within the life cycle processing, but not marketing per se. So important distinction, it's not commercial, and it is very fast, efficient API that provides ability to message across multiple channels too. If you look into APIs, and as I said, if you're sort of just getting through that for sending, triggered send email versus sending up SMS notification versus sending up a push notifications, you'll end up with a different routes, right? With transactional API, what we tried to do was we want to get to the same route, and then you've got different paths to send email or push or SMS notification. It's much easier. Structure of the payload is the same. So you get familiar with a single method, single structure, and then you work with that. And depending on the channel, it's almost like as simple as just flicking between email and SMS, and all of a sudden the messaging remains the same, which is really, really cool. So that's one thing. The other side is it's near real time. Again, I would not hesitate to repeat that because it's important. This is the best and fastest route that we have today from the messaging standpoint of view, if you talk about API integration. So when you do need to provide that high level sort of or high speed response rate, this is the right path to go. Yeah, so that's kind of like one view. the difference with transactional API, it actually supports webhooks. So you can initiate the message and it will respond back to you to provide the payload and results of saying the processing and the send happened correctly, and potentially give you a bit more details outside of the comparing to sort of triggered send specifically for the email in terms of what are the events outside of the send. So it's very useful API to be familiar with. In terms of best practices, some of the scenarios kind of to put in your mind, right? So if you're doing updates for the single contact record, you can look into create subscriber SOAP API. For the rest, you can use contact resource. So there's a correlation, and there are some of the overlaps between REST and SOAP, and you will see some of them as we go along. In a high level sort of volume of data integration cases, like again, being reasonable on what it means, it could be just a frequency of calls. So you might have a smaller payloads, they are atomic, but you've got a lot of these coming through. And if you need to do like the website could be high transactional website, specifically in retail. And specifically these days when a lot of the things happen online, not necessarily at the point of sale, in these cases, you might end up that the API is the right way to integrate, but we just have a high volume of messages coming through. And these messages could be sending communications, accepting the data, doing some updates in the customer details and so forth. All of that, valid use cases, they are atomic in the payloads, but there's a huge volume of those. Then in these scenarios, considering asynchronous API could be the right way to go. So if you face the dilemma on the exam, when you sort of looking into scenario, just kind of keep in mind in terms of synchronous, asynchronous, straight away try to relate to what are we talking about? Do we need to cater for high volume and so forth? And how do we do that? When we're creating triggered send calls, large amount of data does an impact on performance of the send. I mean, again, this is sort of on the paper, just to be safe. Technically, when we're talking about large amount of data, like if we talk, 10, 15, 20 attributes, that's one story. If you're trying to push to 100 attributes, that's a whole lot of different story. But then the question comes in, why would you even want to do that? So thinking about API operations and integration use cases as being atomic, as being small in payload, as pretty much need to know basis. If my message needs to go out and there is 12 fields required for personalization and flicking up the content, then provide 12 fields. You don't need to include the rest of the customer details, the transaction details, all the details about the products, like absolutely not helpful. If you need to think about combining some of these things, right, and this is not necessarily for the exam, but even for practical use case, I've got the transactional message, it goes out, we need to provide the payload of the customer purchase details. It includes transaction details, product details, and so forth. Think about providing a single JSON payload that goes into one field and then utilizing ability to parse JSON within the message to effectively parse and present it out. So that's something to keep in mind. Authentication. So knowing how to authenticate within the REST layer is significant. And when we talk about that, this example provides you the token. So again, we're talking about server to server integration. You've got client ID and client secret, you're providing them. And then in the response, you get the access token and the time that it expires. I believe currently it's like 20 minutes or like 18 minutes time frame that it gives you. It's in seconds, so you can kind of calculate whatever the figure is. It's not, we used to think it's a 30 minutes time frame. It's not, it's a bit shorter. But what is important is you then use that token that is provided to you within the API in the actual payload within the header of the REST calls subsequently. And that tells the platform that this specific call is authorized to perform that. So you've got these authorization bearer with the token that came out from the authentication call. So thinking about the rest, what significance of that is within the authentication, you have two-step layer, right? You need to talk to the platform to get the token, and then using the token, you can actually execute the message. What is significant in this case is we recommend not to go and generate the token for every single use case. So if you have specifically, if you have a high throughput of transactions, we don't expect for every single call you will do 2 API calls. Absolutely not. So it is very important to think about architecting APIs integrations in such a way that we're reusing the tokens as much as we can. We keep track of the expiry time, and it's almost like do a bit of a check. If the token is not expired, make the call, come back. If the token is next to expire, refresh the token and then do the call. So that logic of validating the token, recycling the token is quite significant. And you need to ensure that you sort of cater for that. If you use expired token, you've got 401, and that's effectively the indication that the token expired and you need to refresh that. Without that, there is another point on tokens is for a separate platforms that need to talk to Marketing Cloud. It is recommended to use a dedicated token set. So it's effectively creating your own API integration for every platforms that talk to Marketing Cloud. Because once you refresh a token, every other call would be counted as unauthorized with the previous token set. So therefore, if you get multiple platforms trying to retrieve the token, once they get the token in one place, all other places that might have just received the new token, they'll effectively will be expired. And therefore, it's absolutely critical that you understand one platform has to have their own pathway from the credentials and integration standpoint of view, to ensure that this single platform that handles that credential, these credentials, is the only one that's using them. You can't sort of reuse it. If you do need to have reusability, then you have to have a centralized service that does the authentication and then provide authorization code for any calling environment or downstream payloads. Practically, it's just inefficient because you're going to create your own queues and stuff. It's harder to handle and manage. So therefore, and again, the other side of the IPs, if the IP is different for authorization, then again, it's going to be considered by the platform that it's expiring the other one. So making sure that you keep in mind every IP, every platform that needs to talk to Marketing Cloud has to have their own credential set. That should give you at least as an idea. In terms of, I saw Sebastian ask the question, is 401 counts as a call? Not sure what the significance and importance of that. It's more thinking through, if you send the call, right, if you're trying to do the operation to say, let's say, trigger the message, you're going to get the response back that will tell you it's a 401 code, which essentially tells you that you tried to do an operation, but your token expired, and therefore you're not allowed to perform that operation. So you have to go and requalify that. So you need to reauthorize, refresh the token, and then retry your message send call. It's more thinking about that structure to say, I have a token, when is about to expire? So it's like, let's say 16 minutes from now. That's great. I'm doing my email send call. The response comes back. It tells you platform accepted that or results it. You go, great. The next one comes in and says, well, it's about to expire in 30 seconds. So the best way to think through that, you can try to push it, but it might be that you put some threshold and say, well, it's actually too close to the end. So what I will do is I'll refresh the token first. So I'll do another token refresh API call. Then when I get the new token, which will have 20 minutes expiry time, that's when I do my message send. That's really the logic that you need to think through. If you get to the point where the token didn't expire, you do the call and that expires during that call or just before the platform receives it, you get back the 401. And what's significant is you kind of still need to ensure that for every use case, you validate that you didn't receive the 401 payload, because it will tell you that's an unauthorized request, and effectively saying the platform did not accept your request to do something in the platform. The action was not requested. All right, SOAP API. Let's look into the SOAP API. As I said, this is a much more mature in the sense like it's older. It's been around for quite a while. It's a service-oriented architecture, and if you don't know much about that, you don't really have to know much about that, except the fact that we're exchanging payload in the XML format, and significance from platform perspective, you get access to more sort of older parts of the platform. So email studio, you've got automation studio, you've got administration of the account through SOAP API. You don't have that luxury with REST, unfortunately. If you need to get access to the email tracking data and updating subscribers, updating list, which is thinking about unsubscribe experiences where you need to handle like a custom preference centers, and you still need to signify that the customer unsubscribed. All of these calls are sitting within the SOAP layer and not within the REST. And that's where, as I said, if you think about practicality, most of the time you end up using both, unless you're looking into very specific use case by use case sort of implementation scenarios. We do maintain that API, but we're no longer extending that, with very few minor exceptions. I think not the last year, year before, we did some change, but that's about it. We're not actively looking to add parity to be able to do everything in SOAP. I think there's a vision going forward, if we ever get to that platform 2.0, and it's more of an internal reference, but I kind of highlight this just generic reference, the Marketing Cloud Platform 2.0, whatever that will end up being. My expectation is, based on the development and conversations with the product teams, is we're looking into REST being the go-to standard. So at some point in time in the future, hopefully, we'll get not to see SOAP anymore, and kind of just have one type of API to work with that, with all of these things. There are some limitations that sort of need to be aware of. I mean, in a similar way, think about the SOAP API in the sense that it used to be very specific to user credentials. We sort of moved out of that last year or the year before. We went through the security audit, and that deemed to be insecure way. So even though we today talk about, we've got sort of dedicated endpoints, the move, similar to REST, is now have a tenant-specific endpoint. And from the credentials standpoint of view, we're changing from username and password tied up to the user in the platform to actually now be using REST API as a first layer to get the token, and then using that token that we require through the REST layer within the SOAP API payload. So that provides us a single authentication workflow. We don't have to manage two different types, two different security audits and reviews. We're knowing that the SOAP is now handled through the same authentication credential layer as the REST, and therefore, when the token comes back in, we use that token within the SOAP payload. And the whole API was modernized to ensure that we support this specific use case. Limiting number of calls, it's more, again, we don't have an SLA on SOAP, nor do we have on REST, except potentially for transactional messaging. It's more of a recommendation, because if you hammer the platform with too many API calls, there could be a point of the platform engineering looking to optimizing the endpoint and considering the integration is done incorrectly. So unless they are fully legit payloads, like if there is a lot of duplication, there's a lot of repeat, there is a lot of unstructured, unhandled errors, there is a way for us to fine-tune the platform and prevent some of these things to go through. Now, as opposite to REST, in SOAP, the whole approach that kind of like we're doing and how do we interact with the platform consists of varieties of methods. So you've got a pretty big list that provides us ability to work with data objects. So we've got ability to similar create, retrieve them, update details in some of them, delete some of them, and so forth. But we've got a bit more. We've got, if you think about the context of, for example, Automation Studio, you've got activities that need to be executed or performed. There are some platform routes that you need to be mindful of. And then when it comes down to configuration of some things like business units, roles, permissions, and users, you would use configure option and so forth. So there are few extra things to be aware of. The very simple one, CRUD, right? So create, read, update, delete. These are, or retrieve, not read. They are work with ability, to create one or more records. You've got to retrieve a single object type, and it is important to know that within the payload of SOAP, like comparing to REST. With REST, the route implies that you're working with a specific asset. So if you're working with a contact information, then the route will not accept any other payload that might relate to journey, might relate to content, as opposite to REST. So in SOAP, when I'm creating something, I can actually look into almost structuring the integrity of the payload to say, create data extensions, and then create content templates, and create the message, and create automation, and create query. I can get to the level within one create call, I can combine multiple object types. That is important. So it's not just thinking about a single record at the level of create, but we actually can create multiple object or multiple records, and then across the different object types. So you can create some records in the data extension, create another data extension, and so forth, that expansion. Retrieve only works on one object type, so you can only retrieve records in the data extension, or a listing of the data extension, or folders, but not combination of all of them. So these are separate calls that you'll have to look through. Similar with create update does the multi-object operation and multi-record operation, and delete is individual object or a batch of them. So you kind of frame it how you want to work with them, but you can again work on multiple object types. So in this case, I find SOAP is a bit more optimal if I need to do some sort of data integrity or follow up with the data integrity, because I can sort of retrieve the data in multiple operations, build a payload that needs to be, for example, deleted, especially when I need to delete multiple records from multiple data extensions, but I want to do one single operation and ensure that the entire operation is perceived as a single transaction. Then in the SOAP layer, I can actually construct that and execute that. With REST, it's a bit different story, and I'll have to run multiple calls and ensure every single one of them successful and so forth. So there is a benefit in that sense, from my perspective, as a developer at least, that I found that it is a bit more appropriate in certain use cases. As you can see, so execute, perform, configure, I don't know, I've got multiple performs here. Essentially, they are kind of like operations that you run through. So we at the time when the SOAP was developed, it was considered to be different parts of the platform. So you've got data extracts, you've got queries that you might pull the data, you can run the automation studio programs. And we started almost creating methods at that low level platform objects, which is not really ideal, but essentially this is where we ended up with, and configure is one of those things that sort of helps you with the account configuration if you need to do that. Unfortunately, not all of them are very extensively documented, so some of the things might need a bit of discovery and try and error to understand how to use them and where to play them. The extract, describe, and get system status with a query. So extract runs for the extract packages if you need to do a data extract. Describe provides you sort of a response that tells you the structure of the object. So it's a really good way to interrogate the platform if you ever need to, if you're finding something that may or may not be documented. And one of the good examples was kind of comparing the nodes on if you want to extract information about data imports, the response payloads are in the API level are structured differently compared to some others.
No sé.
Sorry, someone.
Sorry, Vlad, you go ahead. I'm gonna
Oh yeah,
mute them.
yeah, I think it's Sebastian. Yeah, sorry. So you've got the ability to actually understand what is supported from the operation layer. Like, can you update the object? Can you create what fields can you specify and update and create? What can be deleted? What cannot, and so forth. Really good way to explore. Again, these days probably less so, but there are some edge corner use cases that might be helpful. If you're studying, if you're learning APIs, I found that was much better experience for me to go and actually look up into objects. Like when I use describe method to look into what triggered send looks like, what the data extension object looks like, and so forth. When I use describe versus going up through documentation, I just found the response from the platform is a bit clearer for me, because I read go through the XML, I read oh yeah, I can see what fields are useful, what not. Write some script in my Postman collection that parses up the responses, so I can actually extract, progressively additional details that may or may not be documented. But in my way, this is developer layer, and I find my ways to work with that. Get system status is one of the things that we used to talk to. Use it as a ping to identify if the platform is up and running and whatnot. Practically, I don't know how many customers really implemented that. It's just kind of like, hello world. So write an API that pings the system and tells you what's the status of the platform. This is really the use case when you start to go. It's the easiest method, doesn't require much of the payload. Just quickly work out how to execute your first call, essentially, in the practical use case. Knowing the payload, from the exam perspective, I don't think you grilled on what are the different structures, but if you're sort of learning a development part, it is important to understand the difference, because, as I said, it's not JSON, it's XML. Therefore, it implies a certain format and structure for you to provide details. You've got the header that sits at the top and usually provides reference to what method you're executing. So whether it's create, update, execute, and whatnot, provides the authentication of the payload. And then down within the body, you start looking into all the different options on what object you interact with, and then providing the actual payload. Everything is XML, so there is nothing else that you see there. It's pure play XML structure, and Documentation these days was updated to include more practical and useful examples. So it's getting better and better in terms of reading and navigating through that, that's for sure. Some of the common examples, again, just to think through straight away about use cases, something that you need to almost instantly know if you need to work with account, that's a SOAP API use case. If you need to work with account user, which represents Marketing Cloud users, again, SOAP API, right? Data extension and data extension object. So remember the difference between them, because data extension and data extension object, one is DE and the other one is the role in the data extension. I know someone would say, why didn't we call it row? No idea, we just call it data extension object. Again, confusing sometimes, but it is something that we ended up with. Subscriber and list, they're sort of self-descriptive, but kind of this is your, at least at the very least, the go-to thinking of, if I need to do something with these things, then it's REST, it's SOAP, not REST. That's the significance of that. Similar to the rest, we do have a few methods where we can imply asynchronous, where specifically it's if you're executing triggered email send, and if you need to do any operations with the data. So if you need to do add, update, delete operations on the data extension row, these are the ones that are really good for asynchronous, for the exact same principle and reason that I spoke about REST, right? So you want to make sure that they are going through effectively, not holding the calling environment. And it provides ability to, again, include a bigger payload and effectively let the platform handle it. And, you know, one thing to think of, it does have a, I think from our side, it's a bit of a different method to accept them and process them when they hit the actual platform. Not that it matters from the exam or perspective of the knowing that. So we talked about two different methods, right? Two different API types. The important for exam is to know, we talked about authentication. So you've got two different, client ID and client secrets, and two other different ways to talk, not just server-to-server integration. It's significant for exam as well as for your practical use cases to know how to handle errors. And we do have some more recently, and that's been a couple of years from now, but nonetheless, it's still more recent that we introduced the rate limiting factor. So when there is a lot of calls coming up with errors on the API, they do impact platform, right? The concept of shared architecture, we want to ensure that one customer is not significantly impacting others who sit on the same stack or the same account layer within the Marketing Cloud, and therefore, if you ever see the 429 sort of payload or HTTP 500 errors, that like we get to the point where the platform engineering team can actually fine tune and put the account into the rate limiting factor. So I would say there's too many calls, a lot of the errors, you kind of need to sort it out, and lifting the ban effectively, as I call it. It's something that needs to be happening through the support case. So it's not just we will stop making the calls. There is an expectation that client will actually verify the fact that they've identified the problematic point, they fixed it, and then the platform engineering team will say, okay, we'll take off the lift and you can carry on and sort of reintegrate and work back. But until then, the platform will be limiting up how we handle all of these different payloads and calls. So make sure that you do remember that. It's important for exam, and as well as practically. Especially if you're doing, like, one of the cases where it literally came up in more recent time was one customer decided to go a stress load test for integration, and poorly thought about how they want to do that, because they wanted to test a bucket load of different area use cases, but somehow instead of just doing like, how do you handle it, they decided to see how it handles at scale. Whether it was just genuine mistake or intended mistake, I don't really know. I can't speak to that. But the fact that we've picked it up, effectively their load test finished pretty quickly. And more importantly, the problem was that they've done it not in a super smart way, because they've been doing it in one of the business units. But the fact that they still have production business unit, and the ban that goes up into the rate limit actually sets at the account level, not at the business unit level, and therefore some of the production integrations were impacted through that as well. So that's something just more to be mindful of when you're developing specifically. Bear in mind, like, it does matter how many error calls you want to push into the platform and what impact it can potentially have if you're doing wrong approach to development and working with them. From the exam and practical use case perspective, you need to know that there are different types of codes and different types of errors that you might face, right? So starting from understanding, validating the payload, the structure of the call, the attributes that you have included down to authorization, authentication. So there's a difference between authorization and authentication. You need to understand what they are and which is which, right? So you've got access limiting factors. So you might want to say execute an email send or update the records in the data extension, but your API integration was not authorized to do that. So there's a very different point. You might have a valid token, which is really to do with authentication, but the authorization is not quite right. And therefore the system will tell you, no, you can't do that. This operation is not supported. You don't have a permission to perform that action. So these are the differences between that authorization and authentication that at least you need to be mindful of. So when you start working with APIs, it's almost forcibly try to make some of these errors. When you're doing the authentication token request, maybe put the limiting scope and then try to see if you can execute other operations. Explore the error codes and see what payload you get back to understand how would you handle that if that happens in the production environment, sort of thing. And then there's a runtime errors that might have to do with objects, with structures, and so forth. So again, could be a request that's not coming through, could be a platform down, it could be something else in transit happening. Just kind of like making sure you understand these different layers and what are the different types of codes that can be supported. All of that is in documentation. So it's not hidden knowledge, it's just more putting an effort to actually go through that and understand what are these use cases, what is and isn't supported at these different levels and different errors. All right, so I've got a couple of other points to quickly go through. The learning journey that sort of talks about where you should start and what you can do. Number one is Trailhead. So funny enough, like we do, when the developer was coming up, we actually did a really great support from the Trailhead team and the product team, and we did end up publishing the trail that is for developers. So if it hasn't been discussed before, it's certainly something that you can find. You can go on Trailhead, find the Develop for Marketing Cloud. It's a trail that contains multiple sections, and there's one module that talks about API, which is enough for you to get sort of more or less what I spoke about today, but maybe if you want to see it visually differently presented and kind of see how we present it, certainly worthwhile going through. It's not a very long course, but it's practically, I found it was useful. When we were putting together the course, it was a great starting point. When you start practicing, the Postman collection that I will show you shortly as well, it's a fantastic way to learn. Just observing, as I mentioned before, I like to go and visually touch it and see how it sort of looks like. It's a fantastic way to see what the structures of the calls, what information can be included, how responses look like, and so forth. Great way to, even without executing the calls, to really explore what can be done and how it can be performed and so forth. It doesn't cover 100% of the use cases necessarily, but it's a fantastic, as I said, starting point to begin your journey when you learn APIs. Look at what methods, what objects do you go through REST. So contrast them to see how would you execute a triggered send email across REST and SOAP. As one of the good examples, how would you do a data read or data update in both the same way? And then for those of you who might be part of our partner ecosystem, unfortunately, it's restricted for partners. But if you are one of the partners, you're in luck, because we do have a good preparation course for developers, and API was one part of that developer course. So you can access Partner Learning Camp. It's free for partners. It's on-demand curriculum. And you can find the course that will walk you through all of these different sort of learning and help you to kind of deep dive into. There's a bit more guidance in terms of what else can you do from the learning perspective. In terms of practicing, so what I encourage to do is, it's something that we did for our partner course as well, is thinking about if you are to start and you have never done APIs before, like I have here, it's a guided tour for us. We sort of say roughly, if we give you that guided structure of what you need to do, and some sort of pointers, it should take like an hour. It might be a bit more than that, and sometimes it might be actually much more than that, but that's fine. If you can go through all of these steps and get to the point being comfortable with doing them, you're sort of targeting roughly 50-60% of what the exam use cases might be. But notice that not everything here is REST. So we did focus on few SOAP use cases, and the expectation and the guidance was that as a developer, you kind of take it and extend it. So you not just follow these as this is the only thing I want to do. These are the good starting points, because they will put you into the comfort zone to say, all right, if I know how to configure my package, I know how to get the authentication in, then I start plugging it into and building up some of these use cases. And I think this one is a bit dated, because we do have the actually no, sorry, I've already corrected it. The great HTML email goes through the REST, so it's not SOAP. It used to be SOAP. We corrected that because classic content was sunset, so we kind of going up and actually saying build up the email in the content builder straight away using the REST method. So they will give a really good practical flow. And if you think about the use case, you go, well, if I'm deploying something on the account, I've got a message that they need to construct, maybe a dynamic payload. I've got some content that is generated through a third-party system. We want to push it into Marketing Cloud. So you build that email. Then you go and say, well, we need to create a triggered send definition. So we need to have a template. We need to construct the data extension to support that and support personalizations. And you go step by step, building up all of these elements and up to the level where you can push and trigger that. We extended that to include the journey execution. So one of the other things to be mindful of is being able to work with the contact data. So retrieve your contact and then get someone injected into Journey Builder, like within the journeys. So making sure that you can trigger the journey and add people into the journey experience. That was another significant point. I think we did try to do the exits and whatnot, but again, this is kind of goes up to how much you want to explore and how much you want to learn, because practically ability to add people to the journey programmatically, I feel like as a developer, there's a good amount of use cases where it's not just external systems. Like think of API being ability to programmatically do certain tasks. And there is, I know, a lot of innovators who go up and use Cloud Pages, right, for doing certain tasks. The extension of Cloud Pages could be really building up Marketing Cloud web applications. So extending Marketing Cloud, building Marketing Cloud apps. And again, as an application, you can think of utilizing underneath some of the API calls. So you might be, working with data, you might be displaying something to the customer. You might need to retrieve payload on some of the send information in the last 7 days. You want to chart it differently and so forth. You want to look at the performance of Automation Studio programs and say what was run, what wasn't, any errors, any gaps, so provide some statistics. You might look into use cases of building like a mini dashboard for status of the import activities. So if you've got an account with a good number of integrations, they're critical most of the time. And instead of going into the platform and trying to look for every automation or every import, you actually want to visually build up the, the dashboard where you can statistically display what was the throughput for some of these details. It is available in terms of programmatic access to all of the data, but you need to build it and visualize it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be external system. You can build a lot of the things in Marketing Cloud. Landing pages, again, you've got the wrappers into API from AMP-script, from SSJS. We've got ways to access API calls from the scripting languages, and therefore you still have ability to use this and apply them, even if you're not sort of traditionally thinking about integrating with other systems. It just gets sometimes a bit easier. Think about WS proxy with server-side JavaScript, where quite a lot of performance advantages could be found even iterating through the data sets, if you need to combine multiple data sets, if you need to work with the data differently. So you, in essence, executing API payloads. And how would it help you is if you know what the structure of the object is, then you can relate how to construct your WS proxy payload to kind of, call out the environment and get the data out of the platform. So great use cases to think through. As I said, just more, doesn't have to be the endpoint, but to me, it was a really good, like when I was writing that, I felt like if I would be starting to learn it myself, what would be the key things that I'd want people to go through without going up through the entirety of the platform? Because, you won't start with everything on day one. So these are the good, at least good use cases to be familiar with, because they would be the common ones. And extra things that sort of really missing on that slide is just journeys. If you add the line there to be able to add someone to the journey, even the mobile calls, like send an SMS and the push notification, sort of less significant because, these messages could be part of your journey. So you don't have to really, strictly speaking, send a separate standalone SMS communication. You can just add people to the journey and the journey will take care of sending messages. So practicality of that is like, it's in my opinion, is good. If you find it different, and I'd be more than happy to take feedback and look at that, reviewing them in a different ways as well. All right, on the time, I think we're just on the hour. So what I wanted to do is I'm going to switch gears a bit into doing up some quick show and tell on where do you start in the platform when it comes down to configuration. And then after that, I'll be happy to take any questions if we have any. So let me try that. So let me do a new share, switch into the desktop one. All right, let's do that. Let me remove some of these and plug that up. All right, to start, what is important to know is you need to have a permission. So my user right now has Marketing Cloud Administrator and Administrator permissions, and therefore I can go up and do the configuration. There is a permission that limits people to configure their platform tools when it comes down to integration. So if you might have a, like all the admin roles, but there is one particular permission that limits your access to ability to configure install packages. And that's something to be mindful of. If you're working in a customer environment, if you doing some things, you don't, strictly speaking, have to be an admin, but that single permission is the one that is required to get access to the install packages. I can have a look, but I'm sure that all of you can work it out and figure out what it's called. It's really well defined these days, so you can come up and configure it. So I'm in the setup, as I said, platform tools, install packages. This is the place where we configure the integration endpoints and starting your API journey. Without that, you won't be able to do any APIs, even if you have a user. These days, as I said, we went towards the authentication flow, and therefore I need to create the entry points for my integration. So you start with a package, and I'll do MC developer. Apologies if my keyboard is too noisy. I do often recommend to use in the description, you will see the reference to the MID, mainly because I know it sounds weird. In the screen, when we load the details of the packages, we do include these business units, but it's not shown here. So if you have multiple integration points, I encourage you to include the target business unit that particular integration will work with. And if you're using it for external system, do call it out. So I might say meet, I don't know what my meet is. Actually, let me do that. Why would I not know that when I'm in the platform? So I go here and I go and say, okay, I'll take this particular meet and I'll go from the home platform. So it tells me this is my entry point in the application, and then this is my sort of source system. However structured, it doesn't matter, but when you create it, it will be visible in that description. All right, so we started here at this point in time. You can see there is nothing really like happened that sort of drives anything, but what is important, I looked into that, the access. So at this point in time, this package is licensed for a particular business unit. It tells you where it sits. But once I start configuring things, I can actually go and change the applicability of that. And that goes back to that discussion I mentioned before, specifically for REST, but SOAP applies as well. What business unit access you give to that particular integration, these are the business units where that integration can operate and work with. So my next step is effectively configure that component. And remember, I was telling you there's different options to go through. So there's a new one for package manager. I'm more interested in that API integration option. And remember these 3 different options. So again, I did highlight that you need to remember what they are and what these different options are. But if you ever forget this, there's a highlight straight here that tells you what these things are and where you use them. So I'll go with the server to server app, and I get to define the scope. Now, that's where a lot of questions could come up. And remember that authentication versus authorization. This is effectively authorization. What can these credentials do on the platform when it comes down to executing certain tasks? So I would say I might want the platform to interact with read and write of emails, but not send. And therefore I limit that versus I can actually do send. I can do push, I can do SMS, and you can configure it later down the track if you need to. I can do web pages if I need to, working with assets. So I can maybe read, save content, read, and limit that to, well, whatever limits I needed. But when you give more, you can restrict the actual scope at the same time when you start doing authentication call within the payload. So it's more of consideration for you to say, I need a single point, and when I'm making the call, the calling environment will distinguish and identify what scope is required. So you can give yourself a bit more permissions. But again, from the security standpoint of view, it's usually better to go, let's limit to the things that we really need. Practically what I found is, as a developer, it might be a little bit difficult. So I give myself more permissions. And then when I get to my calls, I can know what the structure is, the payload is. Then what I'm doing is I'm practicing with my authentication calls to limit the scope, to narrow down what are the scope items that I need in order to perform my tasks. I mean, there's documentation that covers quite a lot of these details, but if you get into the cross-mixed use cases, sometimes things are obvious and easy to find. Other times it might be a bit more difficult. So as I said, this is where it gets a bit more practical and granular to work and say, well, I want to be able to do certain things and limit it. So when you identify the items that are really required for production, you configure a next package, which is going to be production package. And that will have restricted at this particular configuration. So you give less permissions, more restricted sort of flow versus giving a full set of permissions and then limiting at the call level, just more secure. Access to the connect, data extensions, usually read and write files, tracking events. I don't know what the rate is, but anyway, security. So when it comes down data encryption, you can manage the keys, you can do all of these items, or you can just kind of go and say view logs, and that should be okay. Data factory utilities, more relevant these days when it comes down to integration with CDP. Event notifications, I think these are important going forward. It's sort of something that starts coming out with more and more when you need to do account audit and so forth. So they're practically useful. And then again, you can look into provisioning of the accounts, whether you just want to read and write or just read and so forth. Webhooks are more sitting there. I don't believe we actively using them in the platform today, but anyway, you can configure it. As I said, at any point in time, you can go back and modify that. Now, once that configuration is done, what you see is you've got the client ID, right? This is something that you used for your authentication calls, and client secret. So these are the two things that are critically important for ensuring that you get the permission to operate in the platform. You've got the list of scope items that we've just configured. And again, as I said, these are editable, so you can go and configure them. But from your perspective, practically what is important is you've got this client ID, client secret, and then you've got three authentication or three URLs that you need to use. One is for authentication. You notice that it's different URL. That's auth.marketingcloudapis.com. Then there's a REST, and then there is a SOAP. Now, if you compare all of these, right, they are very much the same. So there's a base URL, which is, I don't know why we didn't extract it. So it's a tenant-specific endpoint. So that's what we refer to be a tenant-specific endpoint. What you want to do is you want to almost highlight these and store it as a separate item. And then you can programmatically append, do you need to go authentication, do you need to go REST layer, or do you need to go SOAP? The Marketing Cloud APIs and all of them is the same. So it's practically at the account level, the tenant-specific endpoint is important, like the tenant-specific ID. And then this is reusable component that goes across all of that. So if you think programmatically, crafting your calls, coding to pick up and build up the payload that needs to be called, or building up the class that will figure out the details and whatnot, it's quite easy to actually code it in such a way that you only provide this as a, like a variables that you pass as parameters or attributes in the setup environment, and then essentially the underlying calls should inherit that and use that. The collection that we have for Postman will effectively use these as well, and it has pre-coded placeholders for variables to begin with. So now once I get these two things, right, I can go into the actual Postman, and it is commonly shared. You can see that I shared that URL with you, as I said before. You go into that Salesforce Marketing Cloud APIs, and it has the structure, the definition of the calls, but you will see that it uses a lot of variables, and they're the ones that you just replace or configure in your Postman environment. If you've never used Postman, which is absolutely fine, it has good tutorials. All you need to really understand is how to set up your environment, what are the variables and how they're used, and then you'll be able to jump in and just get coding without any problems. I'm finding that framework is really good for reusing the same code, because you're not sort of afraid that you're gonna pass the parameters and code it, hard coded somewhere. Everything is sort of separated into variables, and therefore, if you want to share the payload with someone, there's absolutely no risk that you're gonna pass on, your credentials or customer credentials. It's a very safe way and secure way to do that. Now, look at that. You've got the beauty of seeing REST API, all the different methods that you want to work with, right? Transactional messaging, you've got journey builder, identifications, all the things I spoke about. And then you've got SOAP at the same time. So you can work with these key use cases. And you can see there's much more that you can do. But again, these are not comprehensive lists of these are the only things you can do. There's more. It's more like a question, do you need them? And that's where you start going, so what do I do next if I need to explore it and figure out how to work with all of these methods? One thing I didn't necessarily call out was if you get into, where was that API? I think was, there's a reference to the developer documentation. I'm just trying to shortcut it without typing it, but if not, I'll just type it in. So there you go. There's a skip for now. I don't know why I'm not authenticated, but anyway, so you can look into developer website, and it does provide the entry point for like learning at the deeper level. For REST and SOAP both, you've got pretty comprehensive documentation. It's more sometimes finding the useful examples may or may not be easy, but what I find important was for you as a developer, at least to go and explore that, just kind of figure out what are the different types of methods you can call, what are the different payloads, looking at the get, post, and so forth. So you will see that, how does the platform support different things? You've got post, you've got get, you've got put, you've got patch, you've got delete. So there's even more than I told you in the deck, right? So there's a really, really good varieties of them. And if you click on any of them, you essentially can go and have a look and say, well, how does that particular information work? It tells you what parameters you need to pass, what are the different types required and required. So this is really the learning that you have to go and undertake. But the great thing, as I said, comparing starting points. So if I look into that authentication method for requesting token, right? You've got an example here. It's got the how the call needs to be structured. So taking that there's a subdomain. Remember I told you that that bit is going to be the same. So it tells you what it comes in. It looks at the body. So it tells you what are these things. And you go and look at it and you go, well, it's kind of great, but what does it mean? So that's where your documentation is the best friend. You go and have a look and say, okay, grant type, this is what it is. Code, client ID, client secret, right? So that is your two friends side by side, and that's how you work with documentation and the good example point. And as I said before, the great thing about the Postman collection, you can actually see example of the responses. So you straight away see what it might look like. And remember, I was talking about different scopes, right? This is effectively telling you these checkboxes that someone clicked in their account. Here you go, that you can see all of them. It tells you when it expires and all the other bits and pieces that are relevant. So that's a starting point. So anything that you want to do is making sure that you want to jump in. Your environment will come into play. So right here, you will see that you've got different environments you can work with, and there are some even examples. The way to work with that is you kind of hook out these particular workspace into your own local Postman collection. There is a guide that talks you through that. So it's very easy to do. As I said, figure out if you're new to Postman, what the environment means, how to set it up, make sure that you get your variables through. So instead of typing the full, like in this case, you can see that this was that, the client sort of subdomain or tenant specific endpoint reference. You don't want to type it here. You want to have that. And this is the variable, and it tells you, in this particular sort of example is like it seats the current scope at the collection level, and it tells you the values if this variable would be configured in that environment. But when you share that particular payload, maybe with your colleague or someone else, there's no harm because nothing is encoded into the actual payload. So all of the values are sort of just variables. And even here, you see the client ID, client secret, account ID that we're restricting to, like all of that is done in a secure way. So it's a really, really good way for approaching your development and really getting your hands through and trying to work through all of these details. All right. I think that is sort of that is it. So if there's any other questions, and I'll be more than happy to take them now. So let's see if there's anything that come through.
Firstly, thank you very much, Vlad. This is so detailed and very informational, and not only from the certification point of view, but for anybody who wants to get started with the development, this is really helpful. I have a question on the during the package creation, when we are creating a component, there is a checkbox for the webhooks. Can you talk in detail about what that is meant for and how it would be helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the webhooks, we used to look into, so there are webhooks that we have with Transactional API. There are webhooks that we've got with the platform event notifications, but we sort of tried at some point in time building up the webhooks into the platform. So in essence, think about that. Marketing Cloud will inform external system about certain events. That checkbox remained in place because it's still a controllable permissions. And I believe we've got a couple of pilot customers who might be using that functionality, but it didn't see the wider adoption. And we sort of, well, we have to have it because some of the customers are still using that. It's not something that you will proactively use today, at least not at this stage. So it's there for certain reasons, but they're not just GA yet. Let's put it this way. And therefore, they're just kind of taking a bit of a space there.
Understand. Thanks, Vlad. And another question, during the packages creation, can we make a package specific to one business unit?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something that definitely, we do configuration where, let me just see if I do have another credential. Oh, there we go. So let me resume sharing the screen. So I've got a different integration that I've created like some time ago, and you can see that I can go through based on my user. So once I configure the package, I go into that access point, and essentially I have control to enable it for the entire enterprise, or I can go at the business unit level and say, do I want to enable that particular integration for that business unit level or not? So I can go and toggle. It is a bit difficult if you have, like I did at some point in time, like 400 business units to go through and enable, so I can programmatically do some cleanup and management. But you do it once, I guess, and yeah, from the client environment, it's just keeping tabs on. It doesn't make sense. So in some cases, if you want to enable it like broadly across the account, you just go into the top level BU, ticket, enable at the account level, and then you don't have to worry about going through every single business unit. If you need to go at the business unit level, then you've got this option. So it's absolutely configurable and is supported. And as you can see, like a couple of business units are enabled, the others are not. So it's all based on what my user has access to. And then essentially kind of figuring out whether or not you want to allow that integration to be enabled in this specific BUs. Very good question.
That helps, Vlad. And another question is from the certification point of view, and if someone is trying to learn SOAP API, would you recommend WS proxy?
Okay, so practically from the certification, I don't believe we've got a lot of questions, or if any questions on specifically on the WS proxy. Maybe one or two would be there. What it helped, I found, was it's just how you choose to work with API. Because if you use WS proxy, you have to construct and work with all of these different payloads and sort of experiment in the context of landing page, right? So it's more development approach to that. I found that Postman was my best friend when I needed to go through and learn APIs. And this was no kidding. Even after my time in professional services organization, when I need to go back and reinspect some of the things, re-explore some of the elements, rethink some of the ways we did things, I just use that because it helps me to craft the whole message quickly. I can reuse components. It's just, I found it's faster to do that. WU's proxy doesn't give you any advantage during the learning. So that's more giving you extra work to do, because you have to kind of understand how to construct it. And look, to be honest, even I find sometimes it's a bit difficult for me to write the payload request for an object unless I've seen the XML payload that is functional. So I kind of work with get the Postman, get my payload ready in XML. Then I can replicate the XML payload in any other means, whether it's mscript or SSJS or WS proxy specifically, using standard functions. Because as soon as I know what the functional payload looks like, I can then connect and relate them towards whatever the execution environment I need to build it for, not the other way around. So I would say if you're just going to go and blast WS proxy as your way to learn it, you'll probably face more challenges rather than wins on that front. Might be wrong. Maybe you specifically do it, but yeah, that's my point of view.
I agree with that, Vlad. So I also would like to stress on how useful the Postman collection is. So you can start with those, try to understand how they're structured and what calls are being used as well. So if you haven't already explored the Postman collection, Vlad will be sharing the deck, and we will be sharing with you all. You can access those collection and try to play around with those.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just paste it into the chat as well for everyone to see. So you can jump in at any time. That
would be wonderful, Vlad. And I really love the slide that you have in there that talks about the payload errors and the reasons that could result in the error. If the payload results in the 401 error, would that count as a call?
I mean, they as a call, I think I'm sort of addressed that. So don't think it. So there are two things maybe to unwind in this question. So if you're concerned about number of API calls that you do today, so practically, even though we do have API included in customer contracts, we don't charge for over usage. So there is no real constraint or concern, at least at this point in time, and maybe not in the near future roadmap with the current API structure and our support of that we will be billing customers for overages. All right. So if your pure play concern is, do I do too many calls and then the customer will have to pay for it? That's not a concern. So don't get yourself concerned with that just yet. Practically what it means is, think of 401, it's a response. So when you're making a call, right, the key point of learning about 401 is when you're executing a call, if you're getting back a 401, you need to understand that what is the meaning of the 401 code as versus to 500 code as versus to 428 or 426 or whatever. These are the different things that are important. 401 tells you that the platform informs you that the token that you use is expired, or you didn't provide the token incorrectly included in the headers. And that means that the system did not accept your call. So nothing really happened at the platform level. And if your calling environment does not handle that correctly, you might assume that, hey, we've executed that, we've executed the payload and we called Marketing Cloud and it will execute the message. It's not, right? That's the key point of that learning. So if you get 401, you need to go, oh, the token expired. So I need to trigger re-authentication flow. So refresh the token and then go back and re-execute the exact same message. So it's more thinking, if you start whiteboarding that as a sequence diagram, to go, all right, if I call the environment, comes back with 200, okay, great, the call executed. If you go 401, what happens next? You go, I need to get authentication call, get the token back, and then repeat the call. That is the significance of that call. So more like counting the calls doesn't really make any difference. It's just that more, what do you do when you have that response? And more importantly, you need to be prepared for that response. At any point in time, it can happen. Your token get, like, I've personally run into, because I do have within the script the check, like within the Postman collection, I've got the pre-script that tells if the token is expired, do that re-authentication call. I did get a few times, even in my practice, where the token was valid, but by the time the system initiates the call after the check, it was literally a milliseconds race condition where the execution comes back and tells me the token expired. Right, so that can happen in production too, especially if you have a very high transactional platform and where the customers are performing a lot of operations, and you need to be reacting on those through the API in some ways. So in these cases, you want to make sure that kind of like the whole integration is done in such a way that you've got a good handler on accepting the calls into the queue and then handling the authentication accordingly. So for next call, when it's executed from the queue, you've got a good way, or maybe a bit of a contingency to say, well, maybe I'm not waiting for 20 minutes, maybe I'm doing it 18 minutes refresh time. So when the token is 2 minutes to expire, I'll just do the refresh, get the token, and it's another 18 minutes for me to work with. Like that's really significant. And it differs from customers to customer. As I said, in some cases you go, oh, if a token expired, great. If not, like what is the threshold that we want to look into? Even if it's not expired, we still want to refresh that, because that is more of a concern to handle. And again, you still hit one in a million use case where it was expired. You don't want that, so you need to handle it.
That's a great point, Vlad. Would like to highlight one other point here. The client ID and the secret that we use here are like the password to the Marketing Cloud instance. So you need to make sure that you're not sharing with everybody and only sharing to the relevant people.
Absolutely. So the integration that I configured on the screen before, like I already deleted that. Sorry, because it's like, yeah, it's my environment, but still, I'm kind of very cautious of that. And therefore, it's just really important to ensure that when you're configuring that, that's a very good point. They are your sort of keys to the account, so they need to be secure.
And Vlad, I remember you mentioned that though there is a specific limit per edition for the API calls, they may not be exactly built. But if we were to go back and look at the number of API calls done, made for a week or per day or per month, is there a way that we can create a report and see that?
To be honest, I don't think it's exposed in the platform like externally. I believe we can look at that from the back end through the support. There is a way for us to access the sort of the gate where we accept in the queue, and we can limit it at the tenant view. We don't get to see the details because the API, I think, are done in such a way that we're not exposing the payloads for the sake of data not being sort of shared when it shouldn't be. But not practically from the account level. I don't believe so.
Okay. And we are at 90 minutes into the meeting, Vlad. If you want to jump off, let me know. We do have the Ask Me Anything panel. We can address the rest of the questions during that session. Or if you have some time for a few other questions, we can take a few more.
Yeah, I'm fine. I've got another 15 minutes or so I can easily spare, so that should be okay.
Okay, so I'll go ahead with the next one. To start with SOAP API development, is Marketing Cloud Fuel SDK a good API client to start with? Is it up to?
Yeah. These are very good questions. So the SDKs that we do have, they kind of come up with a bit of a, so let's put it this way. There was a statement, I think it's still there, but needs to validate every single time, because every time I get to that question, I check it before I say something. But claim was that it was a community-led SDK, and therefore, similar to that Postman collection, it's not necessarily supporting all the use cases, nor it guarantees that it's going to be appropriate for all the scenarios. And there could be some areas that things are not necessarily working. So it is, the idea for that was we wanted to shortcut the development, absolutely. We don't necessarily want you to start from scratch. So yes, it could be a good learning path to look at that. But again, at the time when we had that, there was no Postman collection. And I did encourage a lot of people to go start with it. Like, look at how we wrap the calls, look at what we've done, how we're parsing the payload. So get to the point of maybe you use Node.js, maybe you use, what was it, Python at the time, or C hash. They're more sort of extended. But what you will find that depending on the language as well, there could be a different level of support. So I know at the time, C hash was the most supported in terms of the most built use cases within the SDK. Any other language would kind of shorten and shrink. So starting point, good. Look at the getting it running, run the call, and then explore how we package it up and have done it. That's good. But practically, I'll be honest, these days I start with Postman collection. You'll be surprised. In 2 days, you can learn so much from just hacking through that quickly, adding stuff, removing stuff, you're replacing stuff, duplicating calls. You kind of end up going into a lot of these different calls. You quickly experiment and they all function easily. So a lot of these boilerplate stuff is already done for you. Just kind of take something, copy it across, and then start tinkering with it. It's much faster way to learn, at least from my point of view, comparing to just coding it and wrapping up into execution environment, because it goes up into, you need an like ID, You need to package up some sort of classes that call these and that. I'm just finding it's an extra sort of noise that I would avoid if all I need to know is just learning the actual API. Postman gives you a great ability to wrap up the code. So once you constructed that API payload, you can actually generate the code for a lot of languages. That was another great thing that I personally learned about is within the Postman, once you get the code ready, you can just go generate Node.js payload and it does all the magic for you. So it's even more advanced in that sense that you kind of be language agnostic and it builds you a lot of the stuff that sort of SDK was meant to provide, but it may or may not be. So I found like that is actually more productive again from building it up. And the other side is because you've got the you can see payload, but because it does support, JavaScript before the call and after the call, and you can do a lot of powerful tools with that. When you look into a test here, you will see that we can actually process and parse the details. So I can do like assertion test to say, was the call successful, not successful, look for the specific payload in the response. I can parse out the details, update my variables, push them into collection, and really orchestrate almost like a multi-call integration to be executed from that environment. To give you an idea, when I was running a lot of these learning training sessions, most of my account provision was done through like 5 or 6 API calls, but I just need to have a list of people who are going to be participating in the training. And then I just use the file as an entry and get the collection to run multiple times. Everything from building business unit, creating user, assigning roles, permissions, limiting stuff, like all of that is programmatic. And once I've done it once, it's so easy to just run. I didn't even bother to try and wrap it up into the language because all it takes me just run the Postman collection and it works. So it's more of the leanest way and fastest way to learn versus trying to get more into getting it ready and functional as a final code. That was the difference for me. So if you learn differently though, as I said, absolutely starting point, good. Whether or not it's going to give you all the options is just more assess that as you start doing that. I would encourage you to go to Postman as a first point, especially if you're starting, because it in my opinion, it will be a faster learning path.
That's very useful tip, Vlad. Thank you. And I think those are all the questions and we have covered everything. Once again, thank you very much for that amazing session, Vlad. And I really appreciate your continued support for all the boot camps and to all the community events. Your knowledge is really helpful to all of us, and you are so forward, helping and passionate to make a difference. We are really glad, and I thank on behalf of everyone.
Totally, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's always great, and as I said, I feel really passionate about people who want to learn that stuff. I think it's very important that we support you. We need more people who are skilled and talented and really genuinely want to do things in our platform. So anything we can do for you, it's just a matter of asking it. And I'm sure there's a lot of I'm seeing a lot of other champions and people just sharing the knowledge and putting in. I'm grateful for all and every contribution to the learning. So I'm pleased and grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vlad. And so I wanted to update about the upcoming session that is on data management by Matthew. That's going to be on Thursday, the 4th day of the bootcamp. And the last day of the bootcamp, we have Ask Me Anything panel where we address any of your questions that are related to the Marketing Cloud development topics and anything that is related to the development certification. Vlad will be joining us on that session as well, along with Elliot, Greg, and Jenna. I have shared the sheet where you can fill your questions in advance. Please feel free to fill that form, and then we will address those questions. And and one other update on the swag, we have a few certification vouchers to share with the regular attendees of this bootcamp. I will be sharing a form for you to fill in the next session. So from that list, we are going to pick up some winners on the last day of the bootcamp. So if you are planning to take the certification, please remember to fill out that form. And thank you everyone for joining today, and I hope to see you again. Thanks, Vlad.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Goodbye.